He said it loud enough for the whole market to hear. Graham Mercer stood between two wooden stalls on a bright Saturday morning, arms crossed, jaw set, voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he had the right to speak. He looked at Mara Ellison, her cracked hands, her sun-worn coat, the quiet way she moved through the crowd without asking anyone to notice her. And he shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've already decided the verdict before hearing a single word of testimony. "I feel sorry for the man who marries her," he said. "Cold as that irrigation ditch she keeps dragging herself back to. Stubborn as a fence post. A woman like that will bury a man before she ever lets him help her." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Mara heard every word. She kept walking. And if you think that's where the story ends, with a woman swallowing her humiliation and disappearing back into the dust, then you don't know Mara Ellison yet. By autumn, Graham Mercer would be standing at an altar, hands shaking, eyes red, speaking vows to the very woman he'd pitied in front of half the county. But before you hear how that happened, you need to understand what it cost her to get there, and what it nearly cost them both. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and follow every part of Mara's journey, because the moments ahead will surprise you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The butter was what people remembered, not her face, not her name, not the fact that she was up before 4 in the morning every single day of the year, including the morning after her father's funeral, including every morning that winter when the temperature dropped so far below freezing that the water in the hand basin beside her bed turned solid overnight. People in Redstone Crossing remembered the butter, pale gold, smooth, wrapped in clean cloth, and set out on the market table with a quiet precision that should have told anyone paying attention that the woman who made it didn't do anything carelessly. Nobody was paying attention. That was the part Mara had learned to live with. Not easily, not without cost. But she had learned it the way you learn to walk on a twisted ankle. You adjust your weight, you keep moving, and you tell yourself the pain will become familiar enough to ignore. She was 26 years old, and she had been running the Ellison homestead alone for 14 months. Her father, Douglas Ellison, had died of a fever in late spring the year before. Not dramatically, not with any sense of timing or mercy. He had been sick for 3 weeks, then he was gone, and Mara had stood at the edge of his grave on a Tuesday afternoon with 6 neighbors who came out of obligation and a cousin she hadn't seen in 2 years standing at the back of the small gathering like he was calculating something. Silas Ellison had always been calculating something. But Mara didn't think about Silas much that day. She thought about the headgate. Her father had built it himself, the iron mechanism at the edge of the property that controlled the flow of water from a hidden spring tucked into the rock shelf below the eastern pasture. Douglas had spent 3 winters designing it, adjusting it, teaching himself the precise sequence of movements required to open it without causing the pressure buildup that would destroy the channel walls. He had taught Mara the sequence when she was 11 years old. He had made her practice it until her small arms ached and her fingers knew the motion without her brain needing to instruct them. "This gate is your inheritance," he had told her once. "Not the cattle, not the land title, this." She had thought he was being sentimental. She understood now that he had been telling her something she needed to survive. The Tuesday after her father's funeral, Mara woke at 3:45 in the morning because the cattle needed feeding and the feed didn't move itself. She worked until 7. She ate half a biscuit standing over the dry sink. She went back out and worked until noon, mending the eastern fence line where the posts had rotted through in 2 places. She broke for water and went back out until dark. She did the same thing the next day, and the next. She didn't tell anyone how tired she was. There was no one to tell, and even if there had been, she wasn't sure she had the vocabulary for it. Tired didn't feel like the right word. Tired suggested something temporary, something that sleep could fix. What Mara felt was more structural than that, more like a load-bearing wall that had been quietly cracking for months. And if you looked at it too closely, you might realize it was the only thing keeping the whole house standing. She kept the butter production going because the butter was income. She kept the cattle because the cattle were her father's legacy. She kept the headgate mechanism clean and properly tensioned because, without the spring water, neither the cattle nor the butter would survive the dry months. And they were always in the dry months now. The drought had been building for 3 years, and even the old-timers in Redstone Crossing who claimed they'd seen everything admitted quietly that they hadn't seen water disappear from the valley this fast before. Mara's pasture stayed green. Everyone noticed. Nobody asked why. But market Saturdays were the part of the week Mara managed rather than enjoyed. She loaded the butter into the wagon before dawn, drove the 12 miles to town on a road that was mostly dried ruts and loose stone, set up her stall between the Hennessy family's vegetable table and a hardware merchant named Crow, who smelled permanently of machine oil and didn't believe in conversation. She liked the space beside Crow for exactly that reason. The butter sold well. It always sold well. The wives of the prosperous ranchers sent their household staff to buy it. The hotel kitchen on the main street purchased 6 pounds every week without fail. There was a restaurant 3 towns over that had written to ask if she could supply them, and she was considering it, running the numbers in her head during the long silences of the evening when there was nothing left to do except sit with the arithmetic of survival. She didn't particularly enjoy the market itself. The noise made her ears ring by midday. The social dynamics of the stalls, who spoke to whom, who was seen speaking to whom, operated by rules she found exhausting to track. And there were always a handful of men, usually young, usually with money. They hadn't earned themselves, who felt that a woman running a business alone was either a curiosity or an invitation. She had developed a specific expression for those situations, not a glare, not a smile, a particular kind of stillness in her face that communicated, without aggression, that she was not interested in whatever was being offered. Most men eventually redirected themselves toward easier targets. Graham Mercer was not most men, but he had never actually directed himself toward her at all, which was its own kind of insult, though she wouldn't have named it that at the time. Graham Mercer was 34 years old and had inherited the largest ranch in the territory from his father, Calvin, who had died 2 years earlier and whom almost nobody in Redstone Crossing mourned. Calvin Mercer had been the kind of man who built wealth through a combination of genuine competence and a complete absence of mercy, and his son had absorbed enough of the first quality to maintain the empire while spending 20 years quietly rebuilding himself around the damage the second quality had done. He wasn't cruel the way his father had been cruel. He wasn't brutal or deliberately unkind. But he had grown up watching Calvin use people's vulnerabilities against them with the precision of a surgeon, and somewhere in that childhood, Graham had learned to hold himself at a distance from situations that required him to feel something inconvenient. He ran his ranch with efficiency and fairness. He fulfilled his obligations to his workers. He attended the necessary social functions in town, spoke when spoken to, and kept his private life private enough that most people in the county knew his name without having any real sense of who he was. He was not by most measures a bad man. He was not by any measure a careful man when it came to what he said out loud on a Saturday morning when he was tired and cold and standing between 2 market stalls with a man he didn't respect very much but was doing business with anyway. The man was Silas Ellison. And the words Graham said about Mara that morning, the words that carried across half the market square and reached her ears as she was counting change for a customer, were not said with any particular malice. That was almost the worst part. He wasn't attacking her. He was making conversation. I was filling a silence with the first careless thought that came into his head, the way men with a certain kind of social ease sometimes do when they've never had to pay the cost of their own opinions. I feel sorry for the man who marries her, he said, nodding in Mara's direction. Cold as that irrigation ditch she keeps dragging herself back to. Stubborn as a fence post. A woman like that will bury a man before she ever lets him help her. Silas laughed, a short, calculated sound that meant he was filing the information away for later. The people nearby smiled or looked away because it was easier than disagreeing with the wealthiest rancher in the territory. Mara finished counting the change, handed it across the table, thanked the customer in a voice that didn't shake, waited until the cluster of people nearest Graham had moved on to other conversations. Then she packed up her remaining inventory 20 minutes earlier than usual, loaded it into the wagon, and drove 12 miles home on the rocky road without letting herself think about it. She almost made it. It was when she was unhitching the horse in the barn, the familiar smell of hay and cold leather, the routine movements her hands could do without instruction, that the specific phrase came back to her fully. Cold as that irrigation ditch. She set down the harness and stood still for a moment with her back to the barn door, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, the way you do when something has landed too hard in your chest. She stood there for probably 30 seconds. Then she fed the horse, went inside, and started preparing the evening milk run because the calves wouldn't wait for her feelings to arrange themselves. What Mara didn't know, couldn't have known, because she didn't pay attention to Silas Ellison the way she should have, was that the conversation at the market hadn't ended with Graham's careless comment. It had continued for another 20 minutes while she was driving home, and in those 20 minutes, Silas had introduced Graham to a proposal. Silas had been preparing the proposal for months. The old government surveys of the valley had been conducted quickly and carelessly decades earlier by a surveyor who had made certain assumptions about the watershed without actually investigating the geology beneath the eastern pasture. Those assumptions had made it into the official maps. The official maps showed what appeared to be a single connected water source, a watershed that included Mara's Spring as part of a larger formation that spread across several properties. If Silas could argue, legally, that the spring was part of that larger formation rather than a distinct water source developed privately by the Ellison family, then the water rights could be contested. And if the water rights could be contested, the spring could theoretically be claimed under a different property filing, one that Silas had already quietly begun preparing through a lawyer in the county seat. He needed Graham's support, not necessarily Graham's active participation, though that would help. He needed the weight of the Mercer name behind the claim, because a lawsuit brought by Silas Ellison alone looked like what it was, a man trying to take his cousin's land. A business arrangement involving Graham Mercer looked like legitimate commerce. Graham had listened with the focused attention he brought to anything that involved money and territory. He hadn't agreed immediately. I was cautious by nature, and something about the proposal made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't yet examined closely enough to identify. But he hadn't said no. He had said he would think about it. Whoop. The weeks that followed were ordinary weeks for Mara, which meant they were brutal weeks by any standard that didn't involve her habitual refusal to measure her own suffering against anything softer than survival. She lost a calf in early September, not to disease, not to predators, but to a complicated birth that she couldn't resolve in time despite spending 4 hours in the dark, trying. She sat on the cold ground afterward with her coat soaked and her hands trembling and let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took the surviving cow to settle. And then she got up and went back to the house and wrote the loss in the ledger and made a note about what she'd try differently if the same situation came up again. The fence on the western boundary needed replacing, not mending, replacing, which meant lumber she hadn't budgeted for and 2 days of work she didn't have time to spare. She did it anyway, over the course of 4 early mornings before the main workday started, driving posts into the half-frozen ground with a mallet that was slightly too heavy for her and adjusting her grip each time her arms complained. The butter orders increased, which should have felt like good news and mostly did, except that increased orders meant longer processing days, and she was already at the edge of what one person could physically sustain. She didn't think much about Graham Mercer. She thought about him exactly once, on a Wednesday evening in early September, when she was working on the headgate mechanism at dusk and heard horses on the road that ran along the edge of the property. She looked up and saw a single rider moving slowly along the property line. Not on her land, technically, but close enough that it wasn't casual. The rider paused at one point and appeared to be looking at the eastern pasture, where the spring ran quietly below the rock shelf. She didn't recognize the horse at first in the low light. Then she did. It was the gray gelding that Graham Mercer rode when he was traveling for business rather than speed. The patient, methodical horse that suited a man doing something that required him to pay attention to detail. She watched him for a moment without moving because the headgate mechanism tended to make sound when it was worked, and she wasn't sure why, but she didn't want him to know she was there. He stayed at the fence line for perhaps 3 minutes, looking out over the pasture with the particular stillness of a man running numbers in his head. Then he rode on. Mara watched him go. Then she finished tensioning the gate mechanism and walked back to the house in the last of the daylight, and she allowed herself, for the first time since her father's funeral, to feel the specific cold fear that comes when you realize the thing you've been protecting might be less safe than you thought. It was Crow, the hardware merchant, the one who didn't believe in conversation, who told her about the legal filing. He told her because he felt she should know, and because he was one of those people who expressed concern by delivering bad news without any of the softening that makes bad news bearable. He found her at the market 3 weeks later and said, without preamble, Your cousin has filed a water rights claim against the Ellison spring. The hearing is set for October. I thought someone should tell you." Mara stood very still. "Who's backing it?" she asked. Crow looked uncomfortable for the first time she could remember. "Word is Mercer was approached," he said. "Don't know what he decided." She nodded. She thanked him. She finished her market day with the same composure she always brought to situations that were trying to knock her down. And she drove home in the dark this time because she'd stayed later than usual, and she sat at the kitchen table with her father's water survey notes spread out in front of her and started reading them from the beginning. Douglas Ellison had spent years documenting the spring. He had measured its output in wet seasons and dry. He had mapped the underground shelf that fed it, a distinct geological formation separate from the larger watershed that the government surveys had carelessly combined it with. He had written, in the careful handwriting of a man who understood that writing things down was the only real protection against people who wanted to pretend they hadn't happened. This spring is its own source, not part of the valley flow, separate and prior. Mara read it twice. Then she made a list of what she needed, and she started building her case. She didn't know yet whether Graham Mercer had agreed to back Silas's claim. She didn't know yet that he was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake by not simply saying no from the start. What she knew was that the spring was hers. Her father had built the gate that controlled it. Her hands were the only hands that understood it, and she was not going to let anyone, not her cousin, not the wealthiest rancher in the territory, not a lawyer with a convenient reading of an old survey map, take it from her without a fight that would cost them more than they had planned for. Outside in the dark, the spring ran on through the night, cold and steady, feeding the pasture that kept the cattle alive, the cattle that made the butter that put money in the ledger that proved, line by line, that this was not a woman who needed saving. This was a woman who had already survived everything anyone had thrown at her, and she was just getting started. The list Mara made that night covered both sides of a piece of paper and spilled onto a second sheet. She was not a woman who made lists for the comfort of making them. She made them because her father had taught her that the difference between a problem you could solve and a problem that solved you was usually whether you had bothered to write it down and look at it directly instead of carrying it around in your head where it could grow larger than it actually was. The first item on the list was the surveyor's original field notes. Not the official maps, those she already knew were wrong, but the actual handwritten notes from the man who had conducted the survey decades earlier. If those notes existed somewhere in the county records office, they might show the assumptions he had made and where exactly his thinking had gone sideways. A bad assumption documented in someone's handwriting was worth more in a courtroom than a correct assumption nobody had bothered to write down. The second item was a geologist. She needed someone who could look at the eastern pasture, look at the rock shelf, and say in language that a judge could follow, that the spring feeding her land was its own separate formation and not part of the larger watershed the survey had carelessly bundled it with. She didn't know any geologists. She didn't have money for a geologist. She wrote it on the list anyway and put a star next to it, which was her system for things that were essential and complicated simultaneously. The third item, written in smaller letters and underlined twice, was simply, Graham Mercer. What did he decide? She folded the list and put it in the pocket of her work coat, where it stayed for the next 3 days while she did the morning milking, the butter processing, the fence checks, the evening feeding, and all the other tasks that didn't stop because her land was being threatened. Problems didn't pause work. Work was actually the only thing that kept problems from becoming catastrophes, because as long as you were still producing, you still had something to protect. It was on the third day that Graham Mercer came to her gate. She heard the horse before she saw him, that gray gelding moving at a deliberate pace up the road that led to the Ellison property. She was in the yard, splitting wood for the kitchen stove, and she set the axe down and watched him come without making any move to meet him halfway. If he was coming to deliver bad news on behalf of Silas, he could come all the way and look her in the eye when he did it. He pulled up at the gate and dismounted. He tied the horse properly, which she noticed because a man in a hurry, or a man who didn't intend to stay long, ties a horse loosely. He came to the fence. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He took his hat off, which surprised her. It wasn't particularly cold, so it wasn't a gesture about the weather. It was something else. Something that read, she thought, almost like an apology preparing to introduce itself. "I'd like to talk to you about Silas's filing," he said, "if you're willing." She picked the axe back up, not because she needed to split more wood at that exact moment, but because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. "Are you backing it?" she asked. She kept her eyes on the wood. The pause that followed was not comfortable. "He approached me," Graham said. "I haven't signed anything." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "No," he said finally. "I haven't backed it. I told him I needed more time." She looked up then. He was standing with his hat held at his side and his face doing something complicated. Not guilt exactly, because guilt had a softness to it that Graham Mercer's face didn't currently have. It was more like the expression of a man who has looked at a set of numbers and realized the calculation he was running had a fundamental error somewhere in it, and he needed to find it before he committed to anything. "More time for what?" she asked. "To look at the land myself," he said, to understand what he's actually claiming." She set the axe down again and crossed the yard to the gate. She stopped on her side of it, which put maybe 4 feet of distance between them, and she looked at him the way she looked at a fence post she was considering whether to replace or try to salvage. "You rode along my property line 3 weeks ago," she said. He didn't flinch, which she respected slightly despite herself. "I did." "You were looking at the eastern pasture." "Yes." "And?" He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to see the spring itself," he said. "If you'll show me." She should have said no. She would understand that showing Graham Mercer the spring that day was either the best decision she made in those months or a risk so significant that it only looked like a good decision because of how things eventually turned out. She would never be entirely certain which. "All right," she said, "come through." The walk to the eastern pasture took about 12 minutes from the yard gate. The path was not obvious. It ran between the second and third cattle grazing areas, behind the hay storage, down a slight grade that looked like nothing from a distance and felt significantly steeper once you were on it. Douglas Ellison had not advertised the path, and over the years the cattle had overgrown the edges of it with their movements until it looked less like a path and more like a coincidental gap between 2 patches of rough grass. Graham followed Mara without speaking, which she appreciated. Men who filled silences with commentary while you were trying to show them something always made her wonder what they were compensating for. The spring revealed itself gradually, first as a sound, a low movement of water beneath stone, then as a change in the air temperature, and finally as the actual sight of the rock shelf opening and the water emerging from it in the unhurried way that things fed by underground pressure move, not rushing, not trickling, but flowing with a kind of settled confidence in its own continuity. The headgate mechanism sat at the point where the spring water met the beginning of the channel system, 12 feet of iron and Douglas Ellison's engineering, weathered gray by years of wet and dry, and everything in between. It wasn't beautiful. It looked exactly like what it was. A piece of functional equipment built by a man who understood the problem he was solving better than any professionally trained engineer who might have taken the commission. Graham stood and looked at it for a long time. "He built this himself?" he said. "Over 3 winters," Mara said. "He kept getting the pressure calculations wrong. The first version blew out the channel wall. Second version controlled the flow but backed up in heavy rain. Third version is what you're looking at. How does it operate?" She looked at him. "I'm not asking so I can tell Silas," he said. "I'm asking because I've seen a lot of water infrastructure in this valley, and I've never seen anything like this." She considered him for another moment. Then she stepped to the gate and demonstrated. Not the full operating sequence, not the precise combination of movements that her father had spent months teaching her, but enough to show that the mechanism responded to specific handling rather than simply to force. Graham moved toward it with the automatic confidence of a man who had handled machinery his whole life. He put his hands on the main lever and pushed. Nothing moved. He adjusted his grip and tried again, using what Mara estimated was considerably more strength than most people brought to the task. The gate didn't budge. He stepped back. He looked at the mechanism, then at Mara, then back at the mechanism. "It's not locked," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "It's not locked." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father built a gate that only you can open." "My father built a gate that requires specific knowledge to open," she said. "I happen to have that knowledge. It's not magic, it's engineering." She watched him absorb that. There was something shifting in his expression that she didn't try to interpret, because interpreting the expressions of men who had recently been considering whether to support a legal claim against her was a project she didn't feel equipped for before lunch. Silas can't operate it, Graham said. Silas has never been to this part of the property in his life. If his claim went through, if the water rights were transferred, then whoever held the rights on paper would have water rights they couldn't actually exercise, Mara said, because the gate would still be here, and the gate would still require someone who knows how to work it, and the only person in this valley who knows how to work it is standing in front of you. Graham was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the sound of the spring became something both of them were listening to rather than simply hearing. That's your argument for the hearing, he said. Part of it, she said. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a rock and turned it in his hands once, the way men do when they're deciding something. I'm not going to back Silas's claim, he said, because you've decided it's wrong or because you've decided it won't work. He looked at her sharply, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too hard. But the sharpness wasn't anger. It was something closer to surprise, the expression of a man who wasn't accustomed to being asked to examine his own motivations out loud. Both, he said finally, if I'm being honest. She nodded. I can work with both, she said. Bob. He left 20 minutes later and Mara stood at the spring for a while after the sound of the gray gelding faded from the road. She was trying to assess the conversation the way she assessed everything, practically, looking for what she'd learned and what she still didn't know. What she'd learned? Graham Mercer had not committed to Silas. He had come to look at the property himself before making a decision, which meant he operated with at least some version of due diligence before doing something consequential. He was not as careless as his Saturday morning comment had suggested, or rather, he was careless in speech in ways he was not careless in business, which was its own kind of information about a person. What she still didn't know, whether his declaration at the spring would hold. Men made decisions in the presence of running water and good arguments, and sometimes walked back to town and made different decisions when the arguments were no longer in front of them. Silas was persuasive in the sustained, relentless way of people who had made persuasion their primary professional skill. Graham was steady, but steady men could be worn down. She went back to the house and wrote a letter to the county records office requesting access to the original surveyor's field notes. Then she wrote a second letter to a man named Aldous Webb, who had worked as a mining assayer for 20 years and had, according to Crow, who knew approximately everyone in the territory, a working understanding of underground geology that came from decades of practical experience rather than formal education. He wasn't a geologist. It was something Mara thought might be more useful in front of a local judge, a man who had spent his adult life reading the ground and could say in plain language what he found there. She sent both letters with the next mail rider. Then she went back to work. Silas came to the property on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the October hearing. He didn't send word ahead. He simply appeared at the yard gate in a good coat and clean boots, which told Mara he had ridden from town rather than from any working property, because nobody who spent time on working land kept their boots that clean past 7 in the morning. She was carrying a milk pail from the barn when she saw him. She set it down and walked to the gate and didn't open it. Silas Ellison was 41 years old and had spent those 41 years developing a particular brand of charm that worked on almost everyone he met. He had a face designed for reassurance, open, well-proportioned, quick to arrange itself into whatever expression the situation required. He had the handshake of a man you'd trust with your money and the memory of a man who never forgot a single thing he could use against you later. He smiled at Mara the way he always smiled at her, with a warmth that never quite reached his eyes, and a quality of attention that was really just assessment dressed in friendlier clothes. Mara, he said, you look tired. Silas, she said, you look like someone who wants something. His smile broadened slightly, the way it did when he decided to drop the performance and try honesty as a tactical choice. I've always respected that about you, he said. Your father's directness. You've got it. What do you want? He leaned against the fence post on his side of the gate with the easy posture of a man who wasn't in a hurry, which meant he was in a hurry and didn't want her to know it. I want to make you an offer before this goes to court, he said, because I don't think either of us benefits from a public fight. I disagree, she said. I think a public fight benefits me considerably. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger yet, more like recalibration. The The spring is worth more developed than it is the way you're running it now, he said. If you let me handle the water rights legally, get them properly documented under a commercial filing. They are properly documented, she said, under my father's name, under continuous beneficial use for 23 years. The survey is wrong, and I can prove it. He looked at her for a moment. The smile had changed into something thinner. Mara, you're 26 years old and you're running this place alone. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to give you a way out of something that's going to drain you for years, even if you win. She picked up the milk pail. Then you should have thought about that before you filed the claim, she said. We're done here, Silas? She walked back to the barn. She heard him stand at the gate for a moment. She could feel the particular quality of stillness that meant someone was deciding whether to call after you or let you go. He let her go. She set the pail down inside the barn door and stood in the dimness for a moment, her hand on the rough wood of the stall partition, and let herself feel the shakiness that she hadn't allowed to show while he was watching. Not fear, exactly. More like the sensation of having walked across a narrow board over a significant drop and only allowing yourself to feel the height once you were safely across. He was lying about wanting to help her. She had known that before he opened his mouth. What she hadn't known was how close he was to dropping the friendly pretense, and the look in his eyes in those last few seconds had answered that question. I was running out of patience, which meant he was running out of alternative strategies, which meant the hearing was his last real option, which meant she had to be ready. The surveyor's field notes arrived from the county records office 9 days before the October hearing. They were worse and better than she had expected. Worse because the original surveyor, a man named Pettifer, had been so careless in his methodology that his notes were barely coherent in places, full of abbreviations that didn't match any standard notation and measurements that contradicted themselves within the same paragraph. Better because buried in the middle of the third page, in writing that was slightly less illegible than the rest, Pettifer had written something that made Mara read it 3 times to be sure she wasn't misinterpreting. Eastern Formation distinct, possible separate feed source. Did not investigate. Time constrained. Did not investigate. Time constrained. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and read those 5 words until she could feel them settling into place alongside everything else she knew. The man who had drawn the maps that Silas was using to claim her spring had noticed the possibility that the spring was its own separate source and had chosen not to find out because he didn't have time. He had just folded it into the larger watershed on the map and moved on. That was the crack in the foundation of Silas's entire case. She wrote to Aldous Webb again, this time with specifics, the Pettifer notes, the questions she needed him to address, the language she thought might land most usefully with a county judge who probably knew water rights law but probably didn't know underground geology. She asked him directly, could he come and look at the Eastern Formation before the hearing? Could he write something down that a non-specialist could read and understand? Webb's reply came 4 days before the hearing. He had already been to the Eastern pasture. He had brought his own tools. He had written 8 pages of assessment in the careful, unadorned language of a man who had spent decades writing reports for mine operators who needed facts, not impressions. The spring was its own source, completely separate geology, different mineral content from the valley watershed, different flow pattern, different everything. Mara read it at the kitchen table and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she put it in her file with the Pettifer notes and her father's documentation and the usage records she had maintained since taking over the property, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks, because she had done everything she could do in preparation and the rest would happen in a courtroom, and there was no amount of additional work that would change that now. What she didn't know, what was happening 20 miles away in Redstone Crossing while she was reading Webb's assessment by lamplight, was that Silas had gone to see Graham Mercer for the second time. The first visit, weeks earlier, had ended with Graham's neutrality. Silas had returned with new arguments, specifically adjusted for the kind of reasoning he'd observed Graham respond to: numbers, territory, future value. He explained that the railroad coming through the valley in the next few years would need water access. He explained what water rights in the path of a railroad were worth. He explained that Mara Ellison, alone on a struggling homestead, could not develop that value even if she kept the legal rights, whereas a properly capitalized operation, the kind Graham could provide, could transform the spring from a survival resource into a significant commercial asset. Graham listened. He asked questions. He did the thing that made Silas good at his work nearly impossible to navigate, which was that he didn't react emotionally to anything, so you never knew where you stood with him until he told you directly. "What happens to Mara?" Graham asked at the end of it. Silas had prepared for this. "She gets a settlement, fair market value for the water rights, plus continued residential use of the property. She loses nothing material. She loses the spring. She loses a resource she can't develop alone." "She's developed it for 14 months by herself," Graham said. "Her father developed it for 23 years before that." "Graham." Silas shifted in his chair, abandoning the polished presentation tone and reaching for something more direct. "She's one bad dry season away from losing that property anyway. The spring is the only thing keeping her viable. If we act now, at least she gets compensated. If we wait, if she keeps fighting and loses, she gets nothing. You're telling me I'd be doing her a favor. I'm telling you it's the practical outcome." Graham was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Silas had not anticipated and would remember for a long time afterward. "I went to her property last month," Graham said. "I watched her work that gate. I tried to operate it myself." He paused. "I couldn't move it." Silas frowned. "The mechanism?" "She's the only one who knows how to run it," Graham said. "Which means even if your claim goes through and you get the legal rights, you don't get the water. Not unless she operates the gate for you. And I don't see her agreeing to that." The silence in the room was the particular kind that happens when someone has just identified the structural flaw that everyone else missed. "That's a problem for after the hearing," Silas said, but his voice had changed slightly. "That's a problem that makes the hearing pointless," Graham said. "You'd win the paper and lose the water." Silas left without getting the answer he came for, and he rode back to town with the controlled expression of a man who was not panicking, but who was doing the mental work of someone running out of viable options in the middle of a situation he had been certain was already decided. Graham sat alone in his study for a while after Silas left. He thought about the sound the spring made when you were standing close to it. He thought about Mara's hands on the headgate mechanism. Not delicate, not performing competence for his benefit, just doing the thing she had learned to do because the spring needed to be managed, and she was the person who had always managed it. He thought about what his father would have done in this situation, and then he thought about the fact that his father's answer to that question had always been the clearest possible guide to what Graham should do instead. He got up and went to find a piece of paper. He wrote a letter to the county judge presiding over the water rights hearing. Not in support of either party, he was careful about that, and he was careful for reasons he would have described as legal, but which were also, he was beginning to suspect, something less comfortable to name. He simply stated, as a property owner who had personally inspected the Ellison spring and the mechanism controlling it, that he believed the hearing should include examination of the headgate itself and the question of who possessed the operational knowledge to manage it. He sent the letter with his personal seal. Then he went back to work, the way he always did when he had done the right thing, and found that it didn't feel as clean or as satisfying as he had hoped, because the right thing rarely did. The valley had a way of delivering news the way weather arrived, quietly at first, then all at once. By the morning of the hearing, everyone in Redstone Crossing seemed to know that Graham Mercer had written to the judge. What they thought it meant varied according to who was telling the story. Some thought he was finally backing Mara. Some thought he was hedging, trying to stay neutral without committing to either side. Some thought he was up to something else entirely, running a longer play that neither Mara nor Silas had seen yet. Mara heard 3 different versions of the rumor before she had finished loading the wagon for the drive to the county seat. She didn't know what to make of it. She filed it alongside everything else she didn't yet know and focused on what she did know, which was the file in her hand. The Pettifer notes with their damning 5 words, Webb's 8-page geological assessment, her father's 23 years of meticulous documentation, and her own 14 months of records since taking over. She had also brought the headgate lever. Not the whole mechanism, that was fixed to the ground and weighed more than she could transport, but the main operating lever which her father had designed to be removable for maintenance, and which fit into her hands with the ease of something that had been shaped by years of use to match her specific grip. She wasn't entirely sure she would use it, but she had learned, watching her father build the gate over 3 winters of failed attempts. that the best arguments were the ones you could demonstrate rather than describe. She climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. Behind her, the spring moved through the channel in the early morning dark, feeding the pasture, keeping the cattle alive, doing the work. It had always done because Douglas Ellison had understood it well enough to build something that served it rather than just exploited it. Mara clicked her tongue at the horse and turned onto the road toward town. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she was going in with every piece of evidence her father had left her, including the ones that couldn't be filed and indexed. The knowledge in her hands, the memory of his voice walking her through the sequence, the absolute bone-deep certainty that this land, this water, this gate, were hers in every way that actually mattered. She had not slept well. Her coffee had been too bitter, and she'd drunk it anyway. There was a loose wheel pin on the wagon that she'd meant to fix for 2 weeks and kept forgetting, and she could feel it in the vibration of the boards under her feet. She was 26 years old, and she was going to court against a man with professional lawyers and years of calculated preparation and the social advantage of being the kind of person nobody questioned. She was not confident. She was something harder and less comfortable than confident. She was ready. The road to the county seat was 18 miles of hard-packed dirt that turned to loose gravel in the last 4 miles before town, and Mara drove it in the gray pre-dawn with the wagon laver sitting on the bench beside her like a passenger she hadn't planned on bringing. The loose wheel pin complained at every rut, a rhythmic metal complaint that she stopped hearing after the first 3 miles. The way you stop hearing a sound that isn't going to kill you, but isn't going to stop either. She arrived at the county seat with an hour to spare before the hearing. She tied the horse at the rail outside the courthouse and carried her file inside and sat on a wooden bench in the hallway and went through everything one more time, not because she expected to find something she'd missed, but because the act of reading her father's handwriting steadied something in her chest that the drive hadn't quite managed to settle. Silas arrived 20 minutes later with 2 lawyers and a surveyor she didn't recognize, a young man in a clean coat carrying a leather case of rolled maps, who had the particular expression of someone hired to present conclusions rather than reach them. They walked past Mara in the hallway without acknowledging her, which she had expected. Silas glanced at her once, briefly, with an expression that was carefully assembled to look like sympathy. She looked back at her father's notes. Graham arrived 10 minutes before the hearing was set to begin. He came alone, which surprised her, and he sat on the bench on the opposite side of the hallway from where she was sitting, and he didn't look at her for a long moment. When he did, he nodded once. She nodded back. Neither of them spoke, because there wasn't anything to say in that hallway that couldn't wait and that wouldn't come out wrong in the particular tension of the moment. The courthouse doors opened, and everyone filed in. The judge's name was Harlan Foss, and he had been presiding over property disputes in this county for 22 years, which meant he had seen every variation of neighbor against neighbor, family against family, and individual against institution that the valley could produce. He was a compact man in his late 50s with the watchful patience of someone who had learned that most of what people said in courtrooms was performance, and that the truth usually turned up somewhere in the middle, quieter and less dramatic than either side wanted it to be. He had read Graham's letter. Mara could tell by the way he looked at the headgate lever she'd placed on the table in front of her, a glance that was too brief to be casual, too considered to be accidental. Silas's lawyers went first, as the filing party. They were good. Mara sat and listened and gave them that much. They had done their work carefully, assembled the case with a coherence that made the wrong conclusion sound reasonable. The official maps, the watershed survey, the legal precedents for consolidated water rights in territories where individual documentation was incomplete. They spoke for 40 minutes, and they made Silas's claim sound less like a land grab and more like a reasonable administrative correction. The young surveyor presented the maps with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. He used technical language precisely when it would obscure and plain language precisely when it would persuade, and Mara watched him work and thought, Silas paid well for this one. When Silas's side finished, Judge Foss looked at Mara. "Miss Ellison," he said, "you're representing yourself?" "Yes, sir," she said. A small sound from the gallery. Not quite laughter, not quite sympathy, but the particular noise a crowd makes when it's watching something it's already decided is going to go badly and wants to feel ahead of the outcome. Mara had heard that sound at the market sometimes, when someone brought in a product they were clearly too proud of, and the regulars already knew how it would be received. She had learned not to let it change the temperature of her blood. She stood up. She set her file on the table in front of her and left it closed, because she wanted to see if she could do the first part from memory. She could. The survey that forms the basis of this claim was conducted by a man named Pettifer in October of 1861, she said. I have his original field notes here. She opened the file to the third page and held it up. On page 3 of those notes, Pettifer wrote the following. Eastern formation distinct, possible separate feed source, did not investigate, time constrained. She set the notes down. The maps that Silas Ellison is presenting today were drawn from a survey whose author himself noted that he had not investigated the Eastern Formation. The watershed consolidation on those maps is not a conclusion. It's a guess that nobody bothered to check for 60 years. The small sound from the gallery was different this time. She set Webb's assessment on the table. I also have here an 8-page geological evaluation of the Eastern Pasture Spring conducted 3 weeks ago by Aldous Webb, who has 20 years of field experience in subsurface water and mineral formation assessment in this territory. She looked at Judge Foss. Webb's findings are straightforward. The spring on the Ellison property draws from a completely separate underground formation. Different mineral content, different pressure gradient, different everything. It is not part of the valley watershed. It never was. Silas's lead lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, this assessment was conducted by an assayer, not a licensed geologist. Mr. Webb's qualifications are documented in the assessment, Mara said, still looking at Foss rather than at the lawyer. 20 years of practical field work in this specific region. I'd suggest that's worth more than a licensed geologist who's never seen this particular ground. Foss held up one hand to quiet the lawyer. I'll read the assessment, Miss Ellison. Continue. She brought out her father's documentation. 23 years of water flow records, maintenance logs, usage records. The meticulous paper life of a man who had understood that the only protection against being erased was to make sure you left a record that was harder to argue with than a government map. She walked Foss through the timeline. First use of the spring. Construction of the initial channel. Her father's 3-winter project to build the headgate mechanism. 14 months of her own record since taking over the property. Continuous beneficial use, she said. 23 years documented in my father's records, 14 months in mine. That is the legal standard for prior water rights in this territory, and we meet it with documentation that goes back further than Silas Ellison's claim by more than 2 decades. She picked up the headgate lever from the table. I'd like to address one additional matter, she said. Your Honor received a letter from Graham Mercer suggesting the court consider the question of who possesses the operational knowledge to manage the spring. I'd like to explain why that matters. She set the lever on the edge of the judge's platform, not placing it in his hands, just making it visible to him and to the room. My father spent 3 winters building the headgate mechanism that controls the water flow from this spring. The mechanism requires specific sequential knowledge to operate. It cannot be forced open. It responds to technique, not to strength. She paused. 2 weeks ago, a flash flood warning sent every able-bodied rancher in this end of the valley to that gate to try to open the diversion channel. Graham Mercer was among them. He was unable to operate the mechanism. She did not look at Graham when she said this. She kept her eyes on Foss. Silas Ellison has never set foot on the eastern pasture. He has never seen the spring. He has never touched the headgate. He is claiming ownership of a water source that he cannot access, cannot operate, and cannot maintain, based on a survey whose author himself admitted was incomplete. She sat down. The room was quiet, in the particular way that means something has just landed that everyone needs a moment to absorb. Judge Foss looked at the headgate lever. He looked at Mara's file. He looked at Silas's lawyer with the expression of a man preparing to ask a question he already knows the answer to. Mr. Ellison, he said, looking past the lawyers at Silas himself, have you personally inspected the spring in question? Silas began to answer, and his lawyer put a hand on his arm and spoke instead. Your Honor, physical familiarity with the resource is not a legal requirement for water rights ownership. No, Foss said, but it's relevant to the question of beneficial use. He looked at Silas again. Have you? Not recently, Silas said. Not ever? Foss said. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. What happened next came from outside the courthouse entirely, and it came fast. A boy of maybe 12 ran in through the side door of the courtroom, one of the rancher's sons who'd been waiting outside, and his boots hit the wooden floor hard enough that everyone turned before he'd said a word. His face was the particular white of someone delivering news they'd been running with for some time and couldn't get out fast enough. "There's blood," he said, looking at his father in the gallery, and then at the room generally. "Mountain storm last night. It came down faster than anyone figured. Water's hitting the valley. Tom Hennessy says if the upper channel doesn't divert in the next hour, the lower pastures are gone. All of them." The courtroom broke apart in the specific controlled chaos of working people responding to a real emergency. Men were on their feet. 2 ranchers from the gallery were already moving toward the door. Judge Foss looked at the situation with the assessment of a man who had spent enough years in this valley to know that land law was important and water was more important, and right now water was actively winning. "We'll recess," he said. 2 hours. Mara was already standing. The road back out toward the valley took 20 minutes at a hard pace. By the time the first group of ranchers reached the upper channel, the water was already coming, not the gradual rise of seasonal runoff, but the sharp leading edge of flash floodwater, gray-brown and fast, and carrying the particular smell of displaced earth and cold altitude that meant it had come a long way very quickly. Mara heard it before she saw it. The sound was lower pitched than you'd expect, more of a sustained pressure than a rushing. The sound of a lot of water moving with somewhere to go and nothing yet to redirect it. The headgate on the main valley diversion channel was a different mechanism from the one on the Ellison Spring. It was a public infrastructure gate, built by county crews 15 years ago, larger and less precise and theoretically operable by anyone with enough physical strength. 6 men were at it when Mara arrived, including 2 of the Hennessy brothers and a rancher named Daltrey, who was built like someone had stacked 2 men on top of each other. They were pulling at the main lever in rotation because the gate had swollen in the wet. The wood had expanded against the iron housing until the tolerance was gone, and what was left was essentially a fixed object that happened to have a lever attached to it. Graham arrived 2 minutes after Mara. He took in the situation in one long look and went directly to the gate without being asked. He was not a small man, and he put everything he had into it, and the gate moved perhaps an inch and a half and then stopped. "It's bound," Daltrey said. He was breathing hard. "Wood swelled into the housing. Can't get the clearance." "If we don't get clearance in the next—" one of the Hennessy brothers started. "I know," Graham said. He stepped back from the gate. He looked at the water, which was rising along the near bank with a speed that was almost conversational. Not dramatic yet, but committed, the way a decision looks once someone has already made it and is just carrying it out. He looked at Mara. She was already moving to the gate. "Miss Ellison," Daltrey started, and there was nothing cruel in his voice, just the practical doubt of a man who had just watched 6 people fail at something physical and didn't see how a smaller person was going to succeed where they hadn't. "Move," she said. Not loudly, not with any particular heat, just a word that had the quality of something that wasn't asking. Daltrey moved. They all moved, actually. The 6 men, including Graham, stepping back from the gate with the slightly dazed quality of people responding to a certainty they hadn't expected to encounter in that particular moment, coming from that particular direction. Mara put her hands on the gate housing, not on the lever, on the housing itself first, feeling the wood against the iron the way you feel a knot before you try to untie it. The swelling was uneven. She could feel that the upper left corner had more resistance than the lower right, which meant the wood grain had expanded directionally, which meant the lever needed to be worked from a specific angle rather than pulled straight. Her father had taught her this. Not with this specific gate, with the spring gate, with the lessons about pressure and grain, and the difference between a mechanism that was broken and a mechanism that was just binding in a way you hadn't accounted for yet. "All stuck things have a direction they want to move," he had told her once. "Your job is to find it before you start forcing." She adjusted her stance. She put her left hand on the housing corner and her right hand on the lever at a different position than anyone else had used, lower, closer to the pivot point. She pushed, not with maximum force, with directed force, angled toward the lower right where the resistance was least, and simultaneously pressed inward on the housing corner with her left hand to relieve the binding pressure by a fraction of a millimeter. The gate swung open. The water hit the diversion channel and went where it was supposed to go. and the pressure on the near bank dropped with a physical sigh that you could feel in your feet through the ground. For a moment, nobody said anything. The sound of the water in the channel was enormous and immediate, and then it was just present, the way big sounds become present rather than startling once your brain has accepted that the crisis is over. Mara stood with her hand still on the gate housing and felt the vibration of the diverted flow through the iron and into her palms, and she thought of her father the way she sometimes did in moments when the thing he'd taught her had just done what he'd designed it to do. She became aware of the men around her. Daltrey was looking at his own hands with the expression of a man recalculating something. The Hennessy brothers were looking at each other, and then at Mara, and then at the gate. Several of the other ranchers from town who had ridden out for the hearing were standing a little further back, and they were all watching her with the specific quality of attention that means you've just witnessed something you didn't expect, and your brain hasn't yet decided what category to put it in. Graham was standing 3 feet to her left. I was looking at this gate and then at Mara, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the calculation she'd cataloged from their first meeting, not the assessment she'd watched him apply to the spring. Something quieter and less organized than either of those. Something that looked, she thought, almost like the beginning of understanding something he should have understood considerably sooner. "How did you do that?" Daltrey asked. His voice was not skeptical. It was genuinely asking. "The wood swelled unevenly," she said. "You have to compensate for the direction of expansion, or you're just fighting the housing instead of the gate." "We were all pulling straight," one of the Hennessy brothers said. "I know," she said. That's why it wasn't moving." She looked at the channel, where the water was moving correctly now, fast and directed and no longer dangerous. On the far side of the valley, the lower pastures that had been in the path of the flood were still standing. The cattle were still there. The hay meadows, the winter feed supply, the accumulated work of a dozen families. Still there, still intact, still exactly where they were supposed to be. "How many cattle in those lower pastures?" she asked, to no one in particular. "Between all the ranches," Daltrey said. 400 head." She nodded. She picked up the water from the ground where she'd set it and looked at the sky, which was doing nothing reassuring. Still heavy, still moving, still carrying the weight of whatever was left of the mountain storm. "We should check the secondary channel," she said. "If the main diversion is running at this volume, the secondary might overtop at the lower bend." It took a moment in which nobody moved and she wasn't sure if they were going to follow her or not, and in which she felt the particular vulnerability of having just done something significant in front of people who weren't sure yet how to accommodate it. And then Daltrey said, "She's right," and started moving, and the rest of them followed. Graham fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything for the first 100 yards, which she appreciated. When he did speak, his voice was low enough that it was meant only for her. "I tried that gate for 4 minutes," he said. "I know. I watched." "You were there the whole time?" "I arrived when you did." She paused. "You were pulling from the wrong position." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you have told me?" She thought about it honestly. "Probably not right then," she said. "You needed to find out it wasn't going to work before you'd have listened to why." He looked at her sideways. She couldn't read his expression well at that angle and at that pace, but she thought something in it might have been the beginning of something that was going to take him a while to process. "That's an accurate assessment," he said. "Most of them are," she said, and walked faster to check the secondary channel. The secondary channel was not overtopping yet, but it was close, within 8 inches of the bank edge at the lower bend, moving fast and carrying debris that would eventually jam against any obstruction and cause a backup that would be worse than the original flood in some ways because it would be slower and harder to predict. Mara and 3 of the other men spent the better part of an hour clearing the debris load from the channel edges with fence posts and their bare hands, because there was no other equipment on hand, and the work was going to be done with what existed or it wasn't going to be done in time. She pulled a section of fence post from the bank at one point and lost her footing on the wet edge and went down on one knee in the mud, hard enough that she felt it through her whole leg and had to take a second before she could stand again. Daltrey offered a hand and she took it, which cost her less than she thought it would, because the day had already reorganized some of her ideas about when help was appropriate to accept. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said back, and they both understood what he meant, because without the main channel diversion, his herd would be significantly smaller by nightfall. By the time the secondary channel was stable, 2 hours had passed. The sky had lightened slightly, the weight in it shifting from imminent to merely possible. Mara's coat was soaked through the right sleeve, and she had mud on her face and hands and the knee of her work pants, and she was standing with 6 other people in the wet grass of the lower valley, with the particular shared exhaustion of people who have just finished doing something that mattered. Graham was standing a few feet away, his own coat significantly wetter than it had been, his hair pushing against his hat brim in a way that suggested the hat had come off at some point and been replaced without particular care. He looked like a man who had been working, which was, Mara thought, probably the most straightforwardly herself she had ever seen him look. Not the managed authority of the market, not the calculated assessment of his visit to the spring, just a man who had been doing physical work in bad conditions and showed it. He walked over to her. "Mara," he said. Just her name. Not Miss Ellison, which was what he'd called her every time before, the formal distance that said, "We are in a professional situation and I am treating you accordingly." Just her name, the way someone says a name when they've decided to stop performing a version of a relationship and start existing in the actual one. She looked at him. "The hearing," he said. "We should go back." "I know." "For what it's worth," he started and then stopped, because apparently whatever he was going to say didn't have the right shape yet. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "Not now. Let the hearing finish." He nodded. They walked back toward the horses without resolving whatever had just started between them, because the time for that wasn't now, and she didn't pretend it was, which was one of the qualities that made her hard to manage. And also, she was slowly realizing, one of the qualities that had kept her alive and working through 14 months that should have broken her. The courthouse reconvened with mud on the boots of most of the people in the gallery, which gave the room a different quality than it had had 2 hours earlier. The formal distance that courtrooms usually maintained had been reduced by the fact that half the people present had just spent 2 hours doing manual labor together in bad weather, and manual labor in bad weather is one of the more reliable dissolvents of social performance. Judge Foss took a seat and looked out at the room and didn't comment on the mud or the wet coats or the fact that Mara Ellison's right sleeve was still dark with floodwater. He looked at her with an expression that was different from the one he'd had before the recess. Not softer exactly, but more settled, like a man who has just had a piece of information arrive from outside the courtroom that has clarified something he was previously uncertain about. Silas's lawyer attempted to resume where they had left off. He was good enough to try to act as though the recess had been ordinary, as though the flood and what had happened at the main channel gate hadn't just given the entire gallery a live demonstration of precisely the argument Mara had been making about operational knowledge. He talked about legal precedent. He talked about documentation requirements. He talked about the practical value of consolidating water rights under a single properly capitalized operation. He did not look at the mud on anyone's boots. Mara watched Silas while his lawyer spoke. Silas was sitting very still with the posture of a man maintaining a position that was more work than he was letting show. He had not been at the channel. He had stayed in town during the recess, and Mara didn't know exactly what he'd done during those 2 hours. But whatever it was, it hadn't involved floodwater or fence posts or the secondary channel's debris load. He looked clean and composed and slightly apart from everyone else in the room in a way that had probably seemed like authority this morning and now seemed like something else. When Foss asked Mara if she had anything to add before he considered his ruling, she stood up and said only one thing. "Your Honor, I'd ask the court to consider what happened at the upper channel gate this afternoon alongside the written evidence already submitted." She paused. "Not as a legal argument, because I understand that what happens in a flood isn't what decides a property hearing, but as context for what beneficial use actually means. My father spent 3 winters learning how water moves through this valley, so he could manage it rather than be managed by it. I spent 15 years learning what he knew. That knowledge is in the ground and in the mechanisms he built and in my hands. It doesn't transfer with a piece of paper." She sat down. Foss looked at the room. He looked at the headgate lever on the edge of his platform. He looked at Silas, who looked back at him with the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he was no longer certain he understood. "I'm going to take the submitted evidence under review," Foss said. "I'll have a ruling by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Court is recessed." He gathered his papers. He looked at the headgate lever one more time before he stood. A brief look, professional and unreadable. Then he stood and left the platform, and the room began to empty around Mara, while while she sat at her table and let the sustained tension of the day move through her and out, the way water moves through a properly managed channel, not stopped, not dammed up, but directed somewhere it could go without causing damage. She was aware of the room emptying. She was aware of Silas leaving with his lawyers in a knot of quiet, urgent conversation. She was aware of the gallery thinning out, the wet boot prints on the wooden floor showing who had been where and for how long. She didn't move for a few minutes. She sat and let the quiet settle around her. She was not confident about the ruling. She had done everything she could do, and she knew it, and knowing it wasn't the same as knowing the outcome, and she had learned not to confuse the two. Her father's papers were good. Webb's assessment was solid. The Pettifer notes were as close to a gift as a legal hearing was likely to produce. The afternoon at the channel had happened in front of everyone who mattered in that valley, and it had said something that no brief could have said as clearly. But judges made decisions based on law, not on demonstrations, and Foss was a careful man who would read every piece of paper in her file before he decided anything. She gathered her documents back into the folder. She picked up the headgate lever. She walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon air, which had cleared some since the morning, the storm having spent most of itself on the mountain and the valley both, and now retreating into the kind of washed-out pale sky that follows hard weather, where everything looks slightly too bright and slightly too quiet, and you can almost feel the ground absorbing what it's been given. Graham was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He was standing with his hat in his hands again, the same gesture she'd noticed the first day he came to her gate, and she thought that the hat was apparently what he did with his hands when he was about to say something that cost him something. "I owe you an apology," he said. She stopped on the second step, which put her roughly at his eye level. "Several, probably," she said. "Yes," he said, "probably several." He looked at her steadily, and the calculation that was usually present in his face was not the dominant feature at the moment. "I said something at the market last spring. You heard it." "I heard it? I'd like to—" "Not tonight, Mr. Mercer," she said. She saw something move across his face. Not offense. Not quite. Something more like the expression of a man who has built his whole life around controlling the timing of things, discovering that the timing, in this instance, is not his to control. "All right," he said. She walked past him to where her horse was tied, and she loaded the lever back into the wagon, and she began the 18-mile drive home in the early dark with the file of her father's papers on the seat beside her, and the loose wheel pin complaining at every rut, and the pale washed sky going dark overhead. She didn't allow herself to think about the ruling yet. The ruling would arrive at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and there was nothing between now and then that she could do about it, which meant she needed to sleep and eat and be at the courthouse at 9, and everything else would happen in the order it happened. She was not confident. She was something harder than confident. She was the woman who had opened the gate when 6 men couldn't, and whatever Foss decided tomorrow, that was already true, already witnessed, already out in the world, in a way that couldn't be taken back by any ruling or any signature on any piece of paper. The horse found its way home through the dark without much guidance from her, because it knew the road too, and it had made the journey often enough that it could be trusted with the last familiar miles. Her hands and let the motion of the wagon carry her, and somewhere around the 10th mile she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day, not to dwell in it, not to rehearse it, but just to let it exist without managing it, the way you let your muscles recognize what they've done when the work is finally finished. Ahead of her, the homestead was dark against a sky that was showing the first hard points of stars through the last of the cloud cover. The spring was running somewhere in the dark of the eastern pasture, doing what it always did, the water moving through the channel her father had built, and the gate her father had designed toward the pasture that had stayed green through every drought, while the valley around it went pale and dry. She had one more day to fight for it. She intended to win. She didn't sleep well, which she had expected. She lay in the dark, listening to the last of the storm wind moving through the eaves, and ran the hearing through her head, the way you run a fence line after bad weather. Not looking for what held, but looking for what might have given, what small gap might have opened that you hadn't noticed in the moment. The Pettifer notes were solid. Webb's assessment was solid. Her father's documentation was as close to airtight as 23 years of careful record-keeping could make it. The afternoon at the channel had happened in front of people whose word carried weight in this county, and whatever Foss thought about demonstrations versus legal arguments, He was still a man who lived in this valley and knew the names of the ranchers whose cattle had still been standing in those lower pastures when the water diverted. What she kept coming back to was the thing she couldn't control, which was how Foss weighed what he'd seen against what was written. Judges were supposed to rule on law. Judges were also human beings who had watched a 26-year-old woman open a gate that 6 men couldn't move, and human beings carried what they witnessed into their decisions, whether they intended to or not. She didn't know if that worked for her or against her. She didn't know if Foss was the kind of man who would consider it relevant or the kind who would bracket it entirely and rule purely on documentation. She got up at 4 because the cattle needed feeding regardless of what a judge was going to say at 9 o'clock, and the familiar work of the morning helped her more than lying in the dark had been helping her. She moved through the barn in the lantern light and talked to the cattle the way she always did. Not conversation exactly, just the low, continuous murmur of someone who has spent enough time alone that speaking out loud to animals stops feeling strange and starts feeling like the most honest communication available. She checked the head gate at first light. The channel was running normally, the level slightly elevated from the storm runoff, but well within the range the system was designed to handle. She checked the tension on the gate mechanism the way her father had taught her. 3 specific points, in order, feeling for the resistance that meant everything was properly calibrated. It was. She noted it in the log, the same way she noted it every morning, the same handwriting in the same ledger that had now accumulated 14 months of daily entries that said, in the aggregate, what no single document could say alone, this land is managed, this water is cared for. This is what beneficial use looks like when it's real rather than theoretical. She changed into her better clothes. She ate something standing at the kitchen counter because she didn't have the patience to sit. She loaded into the wagon before 6:30 for an 18-mile drive to a 9 o'clock ruling, which was earlier than she needed to leave, and she knew it, but the alternative was sitting in the house counting minutes, and she had never in her life been good at that. Redstone Crossing was quiet when she passed through it. A few early risers on the main street, a lamp in the window of the hotel kitchen where someone was already preparing breakfast for the day's guests. She drove through without stopping and continued to the county seat, arriving 40 minutes before the courthouse opened. She sat in the wagon and waited. The horse stood patiently at the rail with the resigned quality of a working animal that has learned that humans operate on schedules that don't always make sense, but that eventually resolve into movement. Other people arrived. Daltrey, the big rancher from the day before, who nodded at her from across the street. 2 of the Hennessy brothers, arriving together, who did something she hadn't expected. They walked over to the wagon, and the older one, a man named Cole, who she had maybe exchanged 20 words with in her life, said, "We're here." Just that. Not good luck, or "we're rooting for you," or any of the other phrases people use when they want to express support without committing to anything specific. Just "we're here," which meant they had driven to the county seat on a workday morning to sit in a courthouse and be present for a ruling that affected them indirectly and her directly, and they wanted her to know it before she went in. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Cole Hennessy said back, the same exchange she'd had with Daltrey in the mud the day before, and she understood that this was what it looked like when people in this valley expressed significant things, plainly, briefly, without ornamentation. Silas arrived at 8:55 with his 2 lawyers and without the young surveyor, which told her something. The surveyor had been presentational, useful for the opening argument, less useful for a ruling morning when no new arguments were being made. Silas looked as composed as he always looked, the face professionally arranged, the coat clean. He glanced at Mara in the wagon and then away, which was the first time she had seen him not attempt eye contact with her in a situation where eye contact would have given him an advantage. She filed that. Graham arrived at 8:58, still alone. He didn't come to the wagon this time. He went directly to the courthouse steps and stood there with the same hat-in-hands posture she was beginning to recognize as his default position when he was waiting for something he didn't control, which she suspected was a posture he didn't get to use very often. He looked like he hadn't slept particularly well either, though his version of that was more contained than hers, a certain tightness around the eyes, a quality of attention that was too fixed to be casual. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the courthouse. She didn't look at Silas. She didn't look at Graham. She went in and sat at her table and put her hands flat on the folder in front of her and waited. Foss came in at 9 o'clock precisely, which she took as neither a good nor a bad sign because he seemed like the kind of man who arrived at 9 when he said 9 regardless of what he'd decided. He sat. He arranged his papers. He looked at the room with the measured patience of someone who has done this many times and understands that the ritual of it serves a purpose even when everyone present is anxious to skip to the end. "I've reviewed the submitted materials," he said. "All of them." He set his glasses on the table in front of him, which seemed to be a thing he did to indicate he was about to speak without reading from anything. "I want to address the Pettifer survey first, because it's the foundation of the claim before me, and it has a problem." Silas's lead lawyer shifted very slightly in his chair. The survey was conducted in 1861 under a government contract that required the surveyor to document all water sources within the valley watershed boundary. Pettifer documented them. What he did not do, as his own field notes confirm, was investigate the eastern formation on what is now the Ellison property. He noted it as a possible separate source and moved on without determining which it was. Foss picked up his glasses and then set them down again. A map drawn from incomplete investigation is not a legal document. It's a guess with a government seal. The room was very quiet. The assessment submitted by Aldous Webb establishes with reasonable geological specificity that the Ellison Spring draws from a distinct underground formation with separate mineral composition and pressure characteristics from the valley watershed. I find Webb's methodology credible for the purposes of this hearing. His practical field experience in this specific geological region is more probative on this question than a licensed geologist who has not examined this ground. Silas's lawyer opened his mouth. Foss held up one hand without looking at him. The documentation submitted by the Ellison family covers continuous beneficial use of the spring for 23 years prior to the filing date of this claim. The records are consistent, detailed, and corroborated by the property's visible productivity, which this court can take judicial notice of given its location in this county. He paused. He looked at Silas directly. "Mr. Ellison, the legal standard for water rights in this territory is prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. Your filing asserts that the Ellison family's use of this spring was incidental to a larger watershed and therefore did not constitute independent appropriation. The evidence does not support that assertion. The spring is a separate source. The Ellison family appropriated and developed it independently. The prior appropriation doctrine protects that use, and it protects it from the date of first use, 23 years before this claim was filed." He looked down at his papers. "The claim of Silas Ellison against the Ellison Spring water rights is denied." The room moved. Not with cheering, but it wasn't that kind of room, and Foss's expression made clear it wasn't going to become that kind of room. But the particular collective exhale of 20 people who had been holding the same breath for different reasons, and the quiet, immediate conversations, and Daltrey's large hand landing briefly on the shoulder of the man beside him, and Cole Hennessy looking at the ceiling for a moment with his jaw set in the way that meant he was managing something he didn't want to show on his face. Mara sat still. She had prepared herself for this moment in both directions, had tried to imagine losing as clearly as she'd imagined winning, because she'd learned from watching her father that the people who collapsed under bad rulings were usually the ones who had only ever imagined winning, and their shock made the defeat worse than it needed to be. She had tried to prepare herself for both outcomes equally, but the feeling that moved through her now was not something she had been able to prepare for, because you can't prepare for relief of a specific size until you know how much weight you've actually been carrying, and she hadn't known until this moment, hadn't let herself know, because knowing would have made the weight harder to bear, that she had been carrying every year of her father's work and every month of her own and the spring itself and the gate and the cattle and the butter and the green pasture and the whole constructed living inheritance of Douglas Ellison's life. And she had been carrying it with the sustained effort of someone who had decided a long time ago that letting it down was not an option. She let out a breath. It was not a dramatic breath. Nobody around her probably noticed it. But it was the breath of someone setting something very heavy down in a safe place. And it was the most significant thing she did in the 30 seconds after the ruling. Silas's lawyers were already in quiet, urgent conference at their table. Silas himself sat among them with the particular stillness of a man who had been certain about something and was now recalculating from a position he had not adequately prepared for. He didn't look at Mara. He looked at the table in front of him with the expression of someone revising a document in their head, Not the ruling, she thought, but his own plan, the next version of whatever he'd been constructing since before their father's funeral. She watched him for a moment longer than she probably should have, because she wanted to understand something. Not gloat. She didn't have the energy for gloating, and she had never found it useful. But she wanted to understand whether Silas was genuinely finished, or whether this was just a pause in something that was going to continue in a different form. What she saw in his face didn't reassure her entirely. He was recalculating, not surrendering. There was a difference, and she knew it well enough to note it and file it away rather than dismiss it. She gathered her papers and put them in the folder and picked up the headgate lever from the corner of the plaintiff's table where she'd left it the day before. The lever was warm from the room. She held it the way you hold something familiar, without thinking about the grip, because the grip had arranged itself over years of use into something that didn't require thought anymore. She walked out of the courtroom. The hallway outside was beginning to fill with the controlled dispersal of people who had been sitting still for an hour and wanted to move. Mara walked through them and out the front door into the mid-morning light, which was genuinely warm for the first time in days. The storm having broken something in the temperature, the air coming off the mountains clean and cold-edged but not brutal. She went to the wagon and set the lever in the bed and stood for a moment with her hands on the wagon side and let the warmth of the sun hit the back of her coat. "Miss Ellison." She turned. It was Foss. He had come out through the side door of the courthouse and was walking toward her with his jacket on, but no robes, looking like a man who had finished working for the morning and was doing something that wasn't quite part of the official proceeding. She straightened. "Judge Foss?" He stopped a few feet away. He was looking at her with the assessing patience she recognized from the courtroom, but without the professional formality. Just a man looking at another person and thinking about something. "Your father's records," he said. "He kept those from the beginning?" "From the first year he developed the spring," she said. "That's unusual." "He was an unusual man." Foss nodded slowly. "The gate," he said. "The mechanism on your property, not the valley gate, yours. You said it requires specific knowledge." "Yes." "Your father taught you." "When I was 11. He looked at the headgate lever in the wagon bed for a moment. "I grew up on a ranch," he said, "north part of the territory before I read law. My father built his own irrigation works." He paused. "I understood what you were arguing, not just legally." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I could tell." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of being correctly read. "Keep those records maintained," he said. "Whatever Silas does next, and I suspect he'll do something, you want documentation current through this week, this month, this year." "I know," she said again. He nodded. He went back the way he'd come. She watched him go and thought about the fact that judges were people in the same way that anyone was people, and that people sometimes came out the side door of buildings they worked in to say things they couldn't quite say inside them. Graham was waiting at the foot of the courthouse steps. He had been there since the ruling, she thought. He had the quality of someone who had been standing in one place long enough to have made peace with the standing. She walked toward him and stopped about 4 feet away, which was the distance she seemed to default to with him, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the option of ending it. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said. They stood in the morning light for a moment with the noise of the dispersing crowd around them and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have more to say than the moment has so far made room for. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Several, as you pointed out yesterday." "You did point out yesterday was not the time," she said. "It's not yesterday." She looked at him. He was holding his hat in his hands, the brim working slightly between his fingers the way it had the first time he came to her gate. She had decided by now that this was a genuine tell and not performance, that the hat was what his hands did when he was working up to something that cost him. "Go ahead then," she said. He took a breath. "What I said at the market last spring, the comment about—" He stopped. "I wasn't thinking about you specifically when I said it. I was talking to Silas, filling a silence, and I looked over and saw you and—" He stopped again. "That doesn't make it better. I know it doesn't make it better." "It makes it smaller," she said, "which is almost worse. You didn't even think enough of me to be cruel on purpose." He flinched. It was small, but it was real. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." And the spring, when you were considering Silas's proposal. I didn't agree to it. You didn't refuse it either, not for 3 weeks. No, he said. I didn't. He met her eyes. I told myself I was being thorough, that I needed to understand the situation before I made a decision. But the truth is, I was running numbers on whether there was a version of this that worked for me financially, and I didn't stop running those numbers until I went to your property and saw the spring and realized that the water Silas was proposing to claim was water that already had someone managing it, someone who knew it. So you stopped because it wouldn't work, she said, not because it was wrong. I stopped for both reasons, he said, in the wrong order. She considered him. The morning light was direct now, no cloud cover to diffuse it, and it showed him plainly. The lines around his eyes that were deeper than they should be for a man his age, the set of his jaw that was his father's jaw, and the thing he'd spent his adult life working to use differently than his father had. He was not a simple man. He was a man with the specific kind of damage that comes from growing up watching someone use power carelessly and spending decades trying to rebuild yourself around that education without always knowing if you were succeeding. She understood that kind of damage. She had her own version of it. Hers looked like not knowing how to accept help until a flood forced her to take Daltrey's hand. His looked like making financial calculations before moral ones and then having to catch up with himself afterward. "The letter you sent to Foss," she said, "about the headgate." "Yes." "Did it help?" He thought about it. "I think it gave Foss permission to include what he'd observed at the channel in his thinking without it feeling like something he'd brought in from outside the legal process," he said. "Whether it changed his ruling, I don't know." "It was the right thing to send," she said. "It was the right thing to send," he agreed. "In the wrong order. Again." She almost smiled. "Not quite." "You seem to have a recurring problem with sequence." "I'm aware." She looked out at the street, where Daltrey was loading into his wagon, and the Hennessy brothers were talking to 2 other ranchers with the animated quality of men who had just been through something together and were processing it the way working men process things, by talking about the practical implications, while the emotional implications made their way through more slowly underneath. That was the valley. That was the way it worked. You dealt with what was in front of you, and the rest caught up eventually. "I have to get back," she said. "The cattle." "I know," he said. "And I have to think about what Silas does next," she said, "because he's not done. He was recalculating in there." "I know that too," Graham said. "I've known Silas for 8 years. He doesn't quit on something he's invested this much in." "Do you have a sense of what he'll try?" He looked at her steadily. "Railroad's coming through in 2 years. The water rights he was after are going to be worth 4 times what they're worth now once the railroad needs water access. He'll try again. Different approach, different filing, maybe a different partner." "Not you," she said. "Not me," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Why not?" "The railroad argument is real. The value is real." "Because I've seen the spring," he said. "And I've read your father's records and watched you work that gate and spent the better part of yesterday in a flood with you. And because—" He stopped. "Because the value is real and it belongs to you, and those are not contradictory facts, even though I spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to make them contradictory." She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Graham," he said. She didn't say it yet. "If Silas comes back, if he finds a different approach and files again, I'm going to need documentation, current, continuous, detailed. I know. I'm going to need people who were at the channel yesterday to be willing to speak to what they saw. Daltrey will. The Hennessy boys will. I will. And I may need to develop the spring more formally, document the production value, establish the commercial use more explicitly in the records, so that any future claim has to argue against numbers rather than just against a family's documented history." "That's a sound strategy," he said. "It's also expensive," she said. "Infrastructure, expanded channels, possibly a second gate at the lower end of the eastern pasture to manage the flow into the additional meadow I've been eyeing." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning light was still direct and honest between them. "Are you asking me for something?" he said. "I'm describing a situation," she said. "You can do what you like with the description." Something moved in his expression, something that was trying to be amusement and was also something more serious underneath. "You are the most careful person I have ever met," he said. I've had to be, she said. Yes, he said. You have. He looked at the hat in his hands and then back at her. If you're describing a situation where a neighboring property owner with access to capital might have an interest in investing in infrastructure that improves the water management in this part of the valley, legitimately, legally, with appropriate documentation of the terms, that would be an accurate description, she said. Then I'd be interested in discussing it, he said, on your terms. My terms would be that the spring stays mine, the gate stays mine, the property stays mine. Understood. And that any arrangement is documented clearly enough that there's no ambiguity about what belongs to whom. Also understood. And that if you change your mind about the terms, the arrangement ends and the infrastructure reverts. He looked at her. You're protecting yourself from me specifically, he said. I'm protecting myself generally, she said. You happen to be the person in front of me. Fair, he said. He put his hat back on, which she was coming to understand meant he had finished saying the thing he'd been working up to and was returning to ordinary business. Can I ride out next week? To look at the lower meadow you mentioned? Wednesday, she said. Afternoon. I'll be done with the butter run by then. Wednesday afternoon, he said. She climbed up to the wagon seat and picked up the reins. She was aware of him still standing there, and she was aware of the specific quality of that standing. Not waiting for more, not performing patience, just present in the way that some people are present when they've decided something and aren't in a hurry to announce it. She clicked at the horse, and the wagon moved. She didn't look back. Not because she was being cold or strategic, but because she was thinking about the lower meadow and the second gate and the documentation she needed to update before the end of the week, and the expanded butter order from the restaurant 3 towns over that she'd put off responding to because the hearing had consumed everything for weeks, and she was ready now to respond to it. She was thinking about the spring and what came next. She was 26 years old, and she owned the oldest valid water right in the valley, and she had a fence post that needed replacing on the north boundary, and a calf that had been feeding weekly for 3 days, and a ledger that needed the legal costs of the hearing entered before she could see clearly what she had left to work with. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. The difference now was that the work was fully hers, not threatened, not contingent, not waiting to be taken by a surveyor's careless guess, or a cousin's patient scheme, or a wealthy rancher's financial calculations. Hers. The horse found the road out of town and settled into its familiar working pace, and Mara sat with the reins and the morning sun warm on the left side of her face, and felt, underneath the exhaustion, and the practical thinking, and the specific relief of the ruling, something quieter and less practical, something that didn't have a ledger entry or a legal category. She felt like her father would have been satisfied, not proud in the loud way, not the kind of proud that required an audience, just satisfied the way a man is satisfied when something he built does exactly what he designed it to do. When the water goes where he intended it to go, and the gate holds under pressure, and the person he taught to run it turns out to have learned it well enough to stand in a courthouse and explain the engineering to a judge who grew up on a ranch and understood it the way you understand things you've lived rather than studied. She thought about Wednesday. She thought about the lower meadow, where the soil was good, and the grade was right, and the water, if she could get it there consistently, would make the whole eastern section of the property viable in a way she hadn't been able to fully develop alone. She thought about what a second gate would cost, and what it would produce, and how many years of additional documentation it would take before the records were so deep and so complete that no future filing could put a dent in them. She thought about the way Graham had said on your terms, without hesitation, without the negotiating pause of a man trying to find the version of that phrase that costs him less. Just on your terms, and the hat going back on his head, and Wednesday afternoon. She was not thinking about him the way people think about things they intend to have. She was thinking about him the way she thought about the lower meadow, practically, with attention to what was actually there versus what she'd like to project onto it, aware of both the potential and the complications, aware that good ground and bad drainage could coexist in the same field, and that you didn't know which you had until you'd been there in wet weather and dry. Wednesday would tell her something. The weeks after Wednesday would tell her more. She was a patient woman. She had learned patience from the spring itself, from the underground water that had been moving through that rock formation since before Douglas Ellison was born, that had been there when he found it, and would be there long after everyone involved in yesterday's courtroom was gone, that moved at its own pace and responded to handling rather than force, and had kept the Ellison pasture green through every drought that had turned the rest of the valley pale. She had learned patience from her father. She had learned it from the gate. She had learned it from 14 months of working alone through everything the frontier threw at a woman who refused to be reduced by it. She wasn't done learning. She wasn't under any illusion that the ruling had closed anything except the specific question it had answered. Silas was recalculating. The railroad was coming. The spring would be worth more every year the drought continued and the valley water table dropped, and people who wanted things that were worth money had a way of returning to them with different approaches when the first one failed. But she had the records. She had the documentation. She had Webb's assessment and Pettifer's damning field notes, and 23 years of her father's careful handwriting and 14 months of her own. She had the gate. And she had, for the first time since she had taken over the property alone, the beginning of something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Not protection, not rescue, nothing that reduced her to the object of someone else's effort. Just the beginning of being seen, of being known, of having the people in this valley understand, in the specific and unambiguous way that only a flood can teach, that the woman everyone had been looking through was the one the whole valley had needed when it mattered most. She wasn't going to let that be taken from her either. The horse crested the last long grade before the property, and the valley opened up below. The green of her eastern pasture visible even from this distance, improbably green in the dry October landscape around it. The living proof of everything her father had built, and everything she had maintained, and everything she intended to go on maintaining for as long as the spring ran and the gate held, and her hands remembered what they'd been taught. She was home. She had always been home. She had just needed the rest of it to catch up. Wednesday came with the kind of cold that didn't announce itself. You walked outside and it was simply there, settled into the air like a decision that had already been made. Mara finished the butter run by 11, which was earlier than she'd told Graham, and she spent the extra hour checking the lower meadow herself before he arrived. She wanted to know what she was showing him before she showed it to him. She had learned from her father that you never bring someone to a piece of ground. You haven't walked yourself first, because ground has a way of revealing things you didn't expect, and you want to have your reaction to those things privately rather than in front of an audience. The lower meadow was good. She had known it was good in the abstract, but walking it with the specific purpose of evaluating it for a second water channel clarified good into something more precise. The grade ran correctly, east to west, a natural slope that would carry water from the channel extension without requiring pumping or significant earthworks. The soil was deep and dark where she dug at it with her boot heel, the kind of soil that had been accumulating moisture from the spring's peripheral seepage for years without anyone directing it properly. There was already more productivity here than the meadow appeared to have from a distance, which meant that with proper irrigation, it would likely outperform the eastern pasture itself within 2 or 3 seasons. She was standing in the middle of it, working through the numbers in her head, when she heard the gray gelding on the road. Graham came through the gate the way he had the first time, tying the horse properly, taking his time, not performing urgency he didn't feel. He crossed the yard and she met him at the edge of the property, and they walked the lower meadow together for 40 minutes without talking much, which was the right way to walk land you're evaluating. Talking fills the space where observation should go, and they were both people who understood that. He crouched at one point and dug at the soil the same way she had, and she watched him look at what he found and nod in the slow way of someone confirming rather than discovering. 2 seasons, he said, maybe less, with the right channel placement. That's what I thought, she said. The grade works for gravity feed. You wouldn't need a pump. I know. He stood and looked back toward the eastern pasture, calculating the line the channel extension would need to run. Second gate at the lower end of the existing channel, branch line running southwest, following the natural grade. Call it 200 feet of new channel, maybe 220. I priced the materials, she said. 3 weeks ago, when I was still deciding whether the lawsuit was going to leave me with anything worth developing. He looked at her. I was planning ahead, she said. I didn't know how the hearing would go, but if I won, I wanted to be able to move quickly. And if I lost, she paused. I was going to fight the ruling, which would have taken time I didn't have and money I didn't have, and I wanted to know exactly what I'd be working with either way. You priced expansion materials before you knew if you'd keep the property. I priced them because I intended to keep the property, she said. The hearing was about whether the law agreed with me. I already knew I was right. He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of that quiet was something she was getting better at reading. The difference between his thinking silences and his processing silences, and the third kind, which was the one that meant he was sitting with something that had surprised him and deciding what to do with it. The materials cost, he said. I'd like to cover it. I know you would, she said. That's not the arrangement. What is the arrangement? She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the drive home from the county seat, and in the evening since and during the parts of the morning work that didn't require her full attention. She had thought about it the way she thought about the gate mechanism, looking for the version that functioned correctly under pressure, not just the version that looked right in calm conditions. You provide the labor for the channel construction, she said. Your men, your equipment, your time. I cover the materials because I've already priced them, and I know what they cost, and I don't want a debt I can't quantify sitting on this property. The labor is worth more than the materials, he said. I know, she said, which means you're investing more than I am, and you need to decide if that's acceptable to you. Why would I accept an arrangement that costs me more? Because the lower meadow, once it's producing, increases the value of the water rights we just established in court. And you're a neighboring property owner who now has documentation of cooperative land development with the holder of the oldest water right in the valley. She looked at him levelly. When the railroad comes through and starts negotiating water access, that documentation matters. You know it, and I know it. He looked at the meadow. He looked at her. You worked that out. I worked that out, she said. When? On the drive home from the courthouse. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the shape of it in his face. All right, he said, labor for materials. Written agreement, specific terms, both signed. Both signed, she confirmed. And witnessed. Crow will witness it. He doesn't like either of us enough to be accused of favoritism. This time he did laugh, briefly and genuinely, and she thought it was probably the most unguarded sound she had heard from him, and that it suited him better than the managed composure he carried the rest of the time. The construction took 3 weeks in November, working around the weather and the regular demands of both properties. Graham's men were competent and careful, and she supervised their work on her land directly, which she had told Graham she would do before they started, and which he had agreed to without making it a point of negotiation, which she noted and appreciated. She worked alongside them on most days, not because she needed to, they were capable, but because it was her land and her channel, and she wanted to know every foot of it the way she knew the existing infrastructure. She wanted the knowledge in her body, not just in a blueprint. There were days when Graham worked alongside her rather than supervising from a distance, which surprised her initially. He was good with his hands in a practical, unshowy way. He didn't make a performance of the work, didn't seem to need the men to watch him doing it, just picked up what needed doing and did it. She revised several things she had assumed about him during those weeks. Not dramatically, but incrementally, the way you revise a map when you've actually walked the territory rather than read about it. One afternoon in the second week, they were setting the anchor posts for the secondary gate housing, and the ground was more resistant than it had looked. A layer of compacted clay about 18 inches down that was turning a 2-hour job into a 4-hour one. Graham's men had been at it since morning, and the cold was deepening, and everyone was tired in the specific way of people doing physical work in bad conditions who still have hours to go. Graham was working the post driver, and Mara was clearing the clay from the hole with a long-handled tool, and they had developed a rhythm without discussing it. She cleared, he drove, she cleared, he drove. And at some point she became aware that the rhythm was working better than either of them working independently would have, that the timing had adjusted itself to their individual movements without either of them consciously coordinating it. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't say anything about it. But she thought about it later. Silas made his next move in December, as she had expected he would. It wasn't a legal filing this time. Graham had been right that he'd come back with a different approach. Instead, he appeared at the restaurant 3 towns over that had been negotiating with Mara for an expanded butter supply, and he represented himself as a partner in a dairy cooperative that was forming in the county. He didn't mention Mara by name. He presented the cooperative as a new venture, offered the restaurant a guaranteed volume at a price slightly below what Mara had quoted, and implied that the supply chain would be more reliable than that of a single operation producer. Mara found out about it from the restaurant owner, a woman named Bertram, who had been buying Hennessy vegetables and Ellison butter for 15 years, and had a finely developed sense of when someone was trying to cut her regular suppliers out of a deal. "I thought you should know," Bertram said, in a letter that arrived on a Thursday. "I didn't agree to anything, but he'll try somewhere else." Mara wrote back, "Thank you. I'll be in touch about expanding the supply arrangement. I have additional production capacity coming online in the spring." She sent the letter that same afternoon. Then she went to find Graham. He was at his property, working on the winterization of his barn, which was the kind of work that took 2 days and was miserable in cold weather and couldn't be put off. She rode to his gate and he came out when he heard the horse, and she told him about Silas and the cooperative. Graham listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to recognize as characteristic. He listened the way he walked land, with full attention, not preparing his response while she was still talking. "A cooperative," he said. "A fictional one, most likely. Or one he's in the early stages of assembling and planning to build out if it gets traction." "What do you want to do?" She had already decided. "I want to formalize the supply arrangement with Bertram before he finds another supplier to approach. I want to register the expanded production under the Ellison name with the county commercial office, properly, with the spring documentation attached, so that any future cooperative claiming water access in this part of the valley has to account for what I already have on file." She paused. "And I want you to know about it because some of what I'm registering will reference the channel construction and the cooperative development agreement we signed." "That's fine," he said. "I know it's fine," she said. "I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you." He looked at her for a moment. "You make a distinction between those two things." "I make every distinction that matters," she said. He was quiet. The cold was settling in around them in the late afternoon, the kind of cold that came with the particular clarity of a sky that had gone completely clear after weeks of cloud cover, and the light was low and direct and made everything look slightly more itself than usual. "Mara," he said. She had not told him to use her name. She had not told him not to. He had started using it sometime in the second week of the construction, and she had not corrected him and had not said it back to him, and they had both understood that the situation was developing at the pace it was going to develop at, and neither of them was going to try to accelerate it. "Graham," she said. It was the first time she'd used it. He absorbed that without making anything of it outwardly. "Silas isn't going to stop," he said. "Not with the railroad coming. Not with what the spring is going to be worth." "I know. The documentation helps. The commercial registration helps. But what would help most is making it structurally difficult for anyone to construct a competing claim on the water resources in this part of the valley." He looked at the horizon, the low winter light across his property, and hers visible from where they were standing at the gate. If the two largest documented water rights in this section were held by properties with a formal cooperative relationship, not just a development agreement, but a registered operating partnership, that's a significant arrangement, she said. "Yes," he said. "What you're describing would require considerable trust in the terms." "I know," he said. "I'm prepared to have the terms be whatever you need them to be." She looked at him steadily. The light was making it hard to read his face precisely, but she wasn't sure it was the light. She thought some of what she couldn't read was simply that he was not performing anything in this moment, that the usual layer of managed composure was thinner than she'd seen it, and what was underneath was less organized and more honest. "That's a large concession," she said, "coming from a man who spent 3 weeks calculating before he decided not to back Silas's original claim." "I'm aware of that," he said. "What changed?" He thought about it for a moment with the seriousness of a man who doesn't give easy answers to questions that deserve real ones. "I've been watching you work for 3 months," he said. "Not watching in the way I watched the first time, riding the fence line and calculating. Watching the way you watch someone when you're actually paying attention." He paused. "You don't do anything for appearance. Not one thing. Everything you do is because it needs doing or because it's right. You don't perform competence. You're just competent. And when you're not, you figure out how to be, and you don't make a story of it either way." She was quiet. "I grew up with a father who performed everything," he said. "Performed strength, performed authority, performed confidence. And I spent 20 years trying to figure out which parts of myself were real and which parts were just Calvin Mercer's performance that I'd absorbed without realizing it. He looked at her directly. You're the most real person I've encountered in a long time, and I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I know I don't want to do business at arm's length with it when I could do something else. The cold was significant now. Neither of them acknowledged it. What is it you want to do? She said. Something I should have considered before I said what I said at that market last spring, he said. Something I'd like the opportunity to earn rather than expect. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the light shifted slightly and the first stars became visible in the east, which happened early in December when the sky was this clear. Come to the property Sunday, she said. For dinner, not business, and we'll see. Sunday became a habit. Not immediately. The first 2 or 3 were formal in the way of people who know they're establishing a precedent and are careful about what they establish. Dinner at her kitchen table, conversation that covered the properties and the valley, and gradually, as the weeks passed, things that were further from the properties and the valley. His father. Her father. What it had cost each of them to become the people they were, and whether they thought what it cost was worth what they'd ended up with. He told her once, on a cold January evening, about the specific night he had understood that his father was not someone to emulate. He was 16, and Calvin had called in a debt from a neighboring rancher in a way that was technically legal and deliberately cruel, timed to the week of a drought that was already destroying the man's livelihood, designed to take the property at reduced value while the rancher had no alternative. Graham had watched his father sign the paperwork with the satisfaction of a man completing a successful transaction and had understood, with the clarity that sometimes visits 16-year-olds unbidden, that the thing he was watching was not strength. It was the absence of imagination, the inability to understand that the person across the table from you was as real as you were. I didn't know what to do with that, he said. I was 16. You can't leave at 16. So I stayed and I watched and I learned the business and I tried to figure out which parts of what he was teaching me were useful and which parts were the cruelty dressed up as strategy. Did you figure it out? She asked. Mostly, he said. Not always. The 3 weeks I spent calculating on Silas's proposal, that was my father's thinking, running the numbers before the ethics. But you stopped, she said. I stopped because I went to your property and saw something that couldn't be reduced to numbers, he said, which is what my father could never do. He couldn't see the thing that didn't reduce. She thought about that for a while. My father was the opposite, she said. He could see everything that didn't reduce, which meant the things that did reduce sometimes got away from him. He wasn't good with money. He was good with water and soil and mechanics and the long work of building something careful and real. But the ledger, that was always my job, even before he died. You were doing the accounts at what age? 14, she said. He'd look at numbers and something in him just left, like his brain decided it had somewhere else to be. Graham smiled. So between the two of us, we have one complete rancher. She looked at him across the kitchen table. That's a very convenient argument, she said. It's also true. It's both, she said, which is how most good arguments work. Silas's cooperative materialized in February. Not the fiction she'd suspected, but an actual entity, assembled from 3 smaller producers in the northern part of the county who had water access problems and were willing to pool their documentation for a stronger legal position. It was a real operation, which meant it was a real threat, and the filing it generated in March was more sophisticated than the original claim. It didn't target the spring directly. It targeted the expanded channel infrastructure, arguing that the new construction had altered the natural watershed flow in ways that constituted a public resource modification requiring regulatory review. It was clever. She had to give Silas that. The original claim had been a frontal assault, and this one was a flanking movement, coming at the property from a direction that her existing documentation didn't directly address. She and Graham sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours on the evening the filing arrived, going through it section by section. She read, he questioned. They argued about the weak points in the counterargument and the strong ones, and somewhere in the second hour she became aware that the arguing was actually productive, that having someone who thought differently than she did, who came at the problem from the financial and territorial angle while she came at it from the operational and historical angle, produced something better than either of them would have produced alone. She didn't say this out loud. She didn't need to. They filed the counter documentation 2 weeks later, jointly, under both names, which was the first legal document that had both Ellison and Mercer on it in any capacity other than opposition. The counter documentation attached the Channel Construction Agreement, the Cooperative Development Registration, Webb's expanded geological assessment that Mara had commissioned in January as a precaution, and a letter from Foss's court confirming the October ruling and its basis. Silas's filing was dismissed in May. He did not file again. She didn't know if he had run out of approaches or simply decided the cost-benefit had finally shifted against him. She thought probably both. She thought about what Foss had said on the courthouse steps. Whatever Silas does next, you want documentation current through this week, this month, this year. And she thought about the file cabinet in the kitchen that now held 3 times what it had held a year ago. And she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has defended something not through a single dramatic act, but through the sustained, unglamorous accumulation of evidence that says, year after year, I was here, I did this work, I kept this record. You cannot erase what has been this carefully maintained. Graham proposed on a Tuesday evening in June, which was not a romantic evening in any conventional sense. They had spent most of it repairing the secondary gate housing where one of the anchor posts had shifted in the spring thaw, and they were both dirty and tired and standing in the last of the daylight by the lower meadow, which was producing now with exactly the yield she had calculated, and which still gave her a quiet satisfaction every time she walked it. He didn't have a ring. He told her afterward he had planned to have one, and then decided it felt like the wrong approach. That arriving with a ring was performing something in the way his father had performed things, trying to set the terms of a moment, rather than letting the moment be what it was. What he said was, I want to do this properly. I want to ask you properly, and I want your answer to be what you actually think, not what the moment pressures you toward. She looked at him. This is you asking properly? This is me asking, he said. I don't know if it's properly. I've never done it. Neither have I. Are you going to make me say the whole thing? Yes, she said. He said it. He said all of it, including the parts that cost him, that he had started wrong with her, that he had spent 3 weeks calculating when he should have been clearer faster, that he was not finished figuring out which parts of himself were real and which were Calvin Mercer's inheritance, and that she would have to be patient with him on that accounting because it was probably not a short project. I know about long projects, she said. I know you do. My terms, she said. Your terms, he said without hesitation. She told him the terms. The ranch stayed hers, the dairy business stayed hers. The spring stayed hers. The gate and the knowledge of the gate stayed hers. He would be her husband and her partner, and eventually, she supposed, her neighbor, in the most immediate sense. But none of those things would change what the ledger said about who owned what, because the ledger was the record, and the record mattered, and she had spent too much of her life maintaining it to let it become ambiguous. He agreed to all of it. I'd have been worried if you hadn't listed those, he said. Why? Because it would have meant you'd stopped being yourself, he said, and that's not what I want. She looked at him for a long moment in the June light, the lower meadow green behind him and the eastern pasture beyond that, and the rock shelf where the spring ran, audible from where they were standing as the low movement of water that she had heard every day of her life that she could remember. All right, she said. He waited. Yes, she said. That's the answer. They married in September, a year almost to the month since the flood and the courtroom and the specific September morning when Graham Mercer had stood at a fence line and admitted he'd come for both ethical and practical reasons and had gotten them in the wrong order. The ceremony was small because neither of them was interested in an event. They were interested in a fact, and facts didn't require audiences to be true. Daltrey was there. The Hennessy brothers were there. Crow came because Crow had witnessed the business agreement and apparently felt a certain proprietary investment in the outcome of the parties involved. Aldous Webb came from 3 towns over and shook Mara's hand with both of his and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Graham's hands were shaking when he spoke the vows. She noticed and said nothing, not to protect him from being seen, but because it was his business, and because she found, unexpectedly, that she was glad. That a man whose hands didn't shake a little in a moment like that would have been a man who wasn't actually present in it, and she had spent enough of her life in the company of people who weren't present to know the difference. Her hands were steady. She had steadied them by thinking about the gate. The specific physical sensation of the lever and the housing, and the moment when the mechanism gave and the water went where it was supposed to go. She thought about it whenever she needed to be steady, and it worked because the gate was the truest thing she knew. She spoke her own vows clearly, in the voice she used for the courtroom and the morning milking and every other situation where clarity mattered more than performance. The valley changed over the years that followed, the way valleys do. The railroad came through in the second year of their marriage, and the water rights that Silas had tried to take and failed to take became, as Graham had predicted, significantly more valuable. Mara negotiated the railroad access agreement herself, sitting across from 3 company representatives who had come prepared to negotiate with Graham Mercer, and had to recalibrate when they understood that the water rights holder was the woman at the other end of the table. She was 31 by then. She had the documentation to back everything she said, and she was patient, and the railroad paid what the water was worth. The Ellison name stayed on the spring. The Ellison name stayed on the business. The ledger was maintained with the same care her father had given it, and she gave it and would, eventually, give to whoever came after her to maintain. Records mattered. Continuity mattered. The slow accumulation of proof was the only argument that actually held over time, against any challenge, from any direction. Graham never tried to operate the head gate again after the morning he'd failed at the channel gate. Not because she had forbidden it, she hadn't, but because he had understood, on the day she'd walked him to the spring and he'd felt the mechanism not move under his hands, that some knowledge isn't transferable by ownership. It transfers through time and teaching, and the specific attention of someone who has decided that this particular thing, is worth learning the right way. He held the horses instead. Every morning when she went to the gate before the day's other work, he sometimes walked with her and stood nearby with the horses and watched her work the mechanism with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 20 years by then, and he watched the water go where it was supposed to go, and neither of them felt the need to say anything about it. The spring ran on. It had been running before Douglas Ellison found it, and it would run after everyone who had fought over it was gone. Water didn't care about legal filings, or railroads, or the calculations of men who ran numbers before ethics. It moved through the rock in the way it had always moved, following its own logic, responding to the hands that understood it. Mara understood it. She had always understood it. That was, in the end, the only thing that had ever mattered. Not who had the paper, not who had the money, not who had the name or the connections or the carefully constructed legal argument. The thing that mattered was who showed up every morning and did the work and kept the record and learned the mechanism and knew, in their hands and not just in their head, how the water needed to be managed. She had learned it at 11 years old from a man who had spent 3 winters getting it wrong before he got it right. She had maintained it through 14 months alone, and then through the years that followed with a partner who had been honest enough to admit he'd come to her in the wrong order and patient enough to wait while she decided if that admission was sufficient. It wasn't sufficient on its own. What was sufficient was everything after it. The letter to Foss, the Wednesday visits, the construction work in the cold, the 4 hours at the kitchen table going through Silas's second filing, the June evening by the lower meadow, when he'd asked, and she'd made him say the whole thing, and he had. The woman the town had looked through became the one they came to when the water didn't go where it was supposed to go. That happened slowly, without ceremony, the way most real changes happen. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of many ordinary ones, until the thing that was true had been true long enough that people stopped being surprised by it. Mara walked to this gate every morning. The water went where it was supposed to go. Some things are exactly that simple, and the simplicity is not weakness. It is the specific kind of strength that only looks ordinary once you understand what it costs to build.